Chapter 14, Poverty Care, Poverty Cure. Stewardship, Community, and Creativity. If you met Muhammad Yunus, you might never guess that he is listed in Financial Times alongside American billionaire Warren Buffett as one of the 6 greatest financial pioneers of all time. As a young man, Yunus came to the United States to earn a doctorate in economics and then returned to his native Bangladesh to be a professor. To his horror, he found that thousands of people were dying of starvation just outside the university gates. What caused that starvation was the most horrifying thing of all. People were starving, Yunus discovered, not because they were dumb or lazy, but because they lacked the few cents they needed to take their ideas and turn them into businesses that could help their families survive. As Joseph Grenny and his colleagues tell it, Yunus was dumbfounded when he discovered that a woman who made beautiful handcrafted stools was held in poverty because she lacked the 5 cents she would need to buy supplies each day. 5 cents. How is it possible to lack 5 cents? It turns out that this woman had taken money from a loan shark in a desperate bid to buy the materials she needed to make her products. Charged a level of interest many times the total amount of profit she received, this woman found herself in an economic black hole from which she would never be able to emerge without help from someone. Captivated, Yunus studied 42 people and discovered that the total amount of money they needed to finance their businesses was $27. Inspired to act, Yunus started Grameen Bank, which is now a multi-billion-dollar banking and business operation. Grameen Bank provides loans to help more than 100 million people out of poverty. In the process, Yunus has pioneered a whole new industry to help the poor called microfinance, in which investors give small loans to people in developing countries to begin or grow their businesses. Recipients have proved themselves to be enormously responsible, with a repayment rate of around 98%. For his efforts, Yunus was awarded a Nobel Prize. One of Yunus's unique contributions was recognizing that business success is usually not an individual pursuit. To receive loans from Grameen Bank, recipients found 4 friends, each of whom submitted a business plan and held the other members of the team accountable for establishing their businesses and repaying the loan. It was just such accountability that inspired Tanika, a woman in India. Tanika moved from being a wig maker to collecting hair to sell to a company that extracts oil from hair follicles to make health products. This allows hundreds of women to earn money from helping Tanika collect the hair. Lots of families have moved beyond avoiding starvation to actually running a thriving enterprise. Stewardship, community, creativity. These are solidly biblical principles. As we've seen throughout this book, the key to human flourishing is recognizing our value as image bearers of a loving Creator God. In this chapter, we'll learn how it's also the answer to understanding poverty's causes and effects and audaciously moving beyond poverty care to poverty cure. It is in this hope that we'll look at some of the causes of poverty, ask why Christians should care, explore why other worldviews fail to cure poverty, and look at 3 things Christians ought to do to lift individual people, indeed entire societies, out of poverty. Section 2. What is the problem? What is poverty? Poverty is defined in absolute terms as the state or condition of having little or no money, goods, or means of support. Some governmental organizations define poverty in relative terms as referring to people whose income falls below a certain level relative to others in their society. This has led to the demand for governmental redistribution of economic wealth to meet the social and cultural needs of the poor and reduce inequality rather than helping them survive and make it on their own. It's a good example of how the way we define terms determines our actions and the outcomes we expect. In the United States, the federal government defines the poverty threshold as an income that is less than 3 times the cost of a minimum food diet. As of 2015, this was around $12,000 for a single person, assuming that person doesn't have additional means of support, or just over $24,000 for a family of 4. The federal government also uses a supplemental measure that includes clothing, shelter, and utilities sufficient to meet basic needs. By either standard, a surprisingly high number of people in America are poor. During a 3-year period from 2009 to 2011, approximately 1/3 of the U.S. population had at least one spell of poverty lasting 2 or more months. But even the poor in America appear wealthy by the world's standards. For example, Africa expert Martin Meredith has estimated that more than 2/3 of the population lives in extreme poverty. In the 1990s, Meredith reported that the economic output of the entire continent of Africa was less than Mexico and was falling. Its share of world trade was half of what it was in the 1980s. Meredith noted that the 25 countries with the lowest human development scores were African. In fact, Africa was the only region in the world where investment, savings, school enrollment, and life expectancy had fallen since 1970. Africa was also the only region of the world in which illiteracy was commonplace. By 2004, 20 million Africans had died from AIDS, and the infection rates were unthinkably high. In Botswana, one of the more well-developed countries in Africa, 37% of the population was infected. In spite of these staggering challenges, there are signs of hope. A 2013 report in The Economist noted that as country after country rejects socialism and embraces economic freedom, the African economic situation is improving. According to the World Bank, extreme poverty has dropped by half in just the last generation, from 36% of the world's population to 18%. Time magazine reports. Africa's progress is real, dramatic, and by now well established. The International Monetary Fund says that since 2003, gross domestic product across sub-Saharan Africa's 48 countries has risen an average of 5% to 7% per year. In the past decade, 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world were African, and this year 5 African countries will outgrow China, and 21 will beat India. Progress, though, is still tenuous. Africa's material improvement hasn't yet led to political stability. African leaders are notorious for raiding their nation's treasuries of billions of dollars. Election-related violence, including murder, is common. Clearly, short-term prosperity isn't the same thing as long-term economic growth. If Africa uses up its resources in a reckless way, we could see a temporary improvement followed by a long-term setback. Still, says analyst Oliver August, Africa's retreat from socialist economic models has generally made everyone better off. All the talk about economic poverty misses a significant point, though. As counterintuitive as it may seem, the root of the poverty problem may not be economic at all. Philosopher Ronald Nash pointed out that while poverty is sometimes the result of oppression and exploitation, there are also times when it's the result of misfortune, such as accidents, injuries, and illness, or laziness. Proverbs 6 says, "A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." Poverty is a worldview problem. For example, Theodore Dalrymple, a physician and psychiatrist in the poorest areas of London, contends that most of the social pathology exhibited by the underclass has its origin in ideas that have filtered down from the intelligentsia. It was intellectuals, he says, who championed sexual promiscuity, which led to illegitimate births in his hospitals, totaling 70%. Intellectual elites considered the purity of their ideas to be more important than the actual consequences of their ideas. He says, "I know of no egotism more profound." The poor bought into this pack of lies and have suffered accordingly. It's a worldview problem. As you might expect, bad thinking about poverty has led to bad solutions that may have actually worsened the plight of the poor. It's painful to acknowledge, but we're unlikely to find the right way to help the poor without first understanding how the solutions previous generations implemented went wrong. Modern society's war on poverty fails. Before the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, all the nations of the world were poor, much like the continent of Africa today. In fact, throughout most of history, even the wealthy were poor by today's standards. According to economist Angus Madison, the average person 2,000 years ago made about $1 a day in today's dollars. Until 2008, $1 a day was the World Bank definition of extreme poverty. After the Reformation, literacy flourished. Economic principles were articulated, and entire nations rose out of poverty. This produced a thriving middle class for the first time in human history. Social equality grew. As we saw in Chapter 3, biblical thinking about government led to the birth of political freedom and more just systems of law. In spite of dramatic change, though, widespread poverty reigned well into the 18th century. Working conditions were deplorable. Starvation was common. In places like Russia, even into the early 1900s, 4 out of 5 people were peasants with very little property who were always on the brink of starvation. Then something changed, and quickly. In The Grand Pursuit, a sweeping look at the history of economics, Sylvia Nassar reports, a mere 50 years after Jane Austen's death, the world was altered beyond recognition. It was not only the extraordinary advance in wealth, luxury, and refinement of taste, or the unprecedented improvement in the circumstances of those whose condition was assumed to be irremediable. It was the sense that the changes were not accidental or a matter of luck, but the result of human intention, will, and knowledge. As I noted earlier, economist Cleon Skousen called it a 5,000-year leap. Economics grew by leaps and bounds because of free market economy innovations. Poverty was being eradicated. In their enthusiasm to finish the job, though, intellectuals and political progressives decided to give it a little push. The result was disaster, and the story of how it happened serves as a cautionary tale for us today. Can government management of the economy ensure prosperity? Probably not. Economic growth is always a bumpy ride. Fortunes can be won and lost overnight. Catastrophic lows follow euphoric highs. In the 20th century, a British economist named John Maynard Keynes noticed how self-regulating markets can leave people vulnerable to wild swings and wondered whether the government could intervene to make things smoother and more predictable. He concluded that depressions could be cured by encouraging spending and discouraging saving. According to journalist Nicholas Wapshott, Keynes gained followers during the Great Depression in the United States by persuading members of the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration to embrace this view. Roosevelt himself embraced Keynes' ideas enthusiastically. In a radio address, FDR said, "We suffer primarily from a failure of consumer demand because of lack of buying power. It is up to us to create an economic upturn. Not only our future economic soundness, but the very soundness of our democratic institutions depends on the determination of our government to give employment to idle men." With this, Roosevelt embarked on a massive program of government spending and market regulation. For a while, it worked. In post-World War II America between 1947 and 1952, every dollar of debt in the economy yielded $4.61 in value. But according to Summit lecturer and private equity fund manager Toby Neugebauer, let's go with Neugebauer. Today, it yields only 8 cents. If you borrowed $1, invested it, and got your dollar back plus $3.61, you'd be pretty happy. But if you borrowed $1, invested it, and lost 92 cents, you'd be wise to give up the investment. If you're foolish, you'd still have to give up the investment, but probably wouldn't until the coffers were empty. If you got to print money, though, you might never quit your bad habits at all. Probably not even Keynes' cheerleaders could foresee that the federal government could borrow, print, and take so much money out of productive use in the economy that it would drag an entire nation into a more or less permanent recession with more or less permanent unemployment, low tax revenue, and a staggering level of debt that could never be repaid. And much of the borrowing habit began in the aftermath of the Great Depression. One example of the Roosevelt administration's Keynesian schemes was the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. The NRA, headed by General Hugh S. Johnson, operated in a military style. It developed a symbol, a blue eagle, and held marches, rallies, and parades. NRA codes were put into effect for everything imaginable, and industries were pressured to follow them. General Johnson overlooked nothing in his zeal. Here are some of the more odd examples. Code 450 regulating the dog food industry. Code 427 regulating the curled hair manufacturing industry and the horse hair dressing industry. Code 262 regulating the shoulder pad manufacturing industry, and even Code 348 regulating strippers in the burlesque theatrical industry. Looking back, many progressives who champion government intervention are uncomfortable with all the hoopla. It looks like something out of Adolf Hitler's propaganda machine. But at the time, before the world learned how propaganda facilitated the murder of millions, people thought it was a good idea. Those desperate for relief didn't just accept government intervention as a fact of life, they became cheerleaders for it. Was it a winning strategy though? Not really. It seems that the effect of the NRA was negative, even in areas where it was trying to help. For example, the auto industry was forced to raise the wage of factory workers from 35 cents an hour to 40 cents. But those same workers had their work weeks reduced from 60 to 40 hours, which reduced their weekly pay from $21 to $16. Roosevelt tried funding his programs by dramatically increasing taxes. President Hoover had already raised the top federal income tax rate from 25% to 63%. Roosevelt raised it to an unthinkable 79%, assuming that this would bring in the revenue he needed. What actually happened is that people with the highest salaries just quit working so hard. It's easy to see why. If you left your house and knew for a fact that a robber would stick a gun in your ribs and take 94 of the $100 in your wallet, you either wouldn't leave home or would leave the money behind. Roosevelt nearly destroyed the recovery with these maneuvers just at the time it was beginning. Of course, governments need tax revenue to operate, but political leaders have learned the hard way, though some haven't yet learned, that tax policy is very difficult to get right. If you tax goods people need, such as food and inelastic good, you end up hurting those with the least ability to pay. If you tax goods people don't need but like to have, such as a luxury item, this is known as an elastic good. People who can afford those goods will just buy something else. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty and committed billions of tax dollars to develop welfare programs, build housing, and buy food for poor people. Most Americans like the idea of a social safety net and agree we should help people get back on their feet. But how much did the kind of intervention represented by the war on poverty actually help? In the 6 years before the war on poverty began, poverty had dropped to 15%. After the federal government spent more than $20 trillion to eradicate poverty, the poverty rate today remains between 12 and 15%. J. Richards says somberly, "The statistics hide the full cost. Not only did the war on poverty fail, it created economic and social problems worse than those it was meant to solve. Sometimes intervention on behalf of those needing help can actually hurt them. For example, the federal government gives several $billion in aid to countries in Africa. It also gives several $billion a year to American cotton farmers so they can sell their cotton at about 25% below the price on the world market. This government subsidy makes it hard for African countries to sell their cotton profitably. Martin Meredith notes that the trade losses associated with U.S. farm subsidies that West Africa's 8 main cotton exporters suffered outweighed the benefits they received from U.S. aid. These interventions cost taxpayers billions of dollars and simultaneously hurt the world's poor. How can this possibly be justified? Good question. Granted, politicians and bureaucrats have their work cut out for them trying to balance the need for tax revenue while having minimal impact on free trade between households and firms. Tax too little and you may not have enough money to provide government services people want. Tax too much and you hurt the ability of people to grow the economy. George Gilder explains, there is a paradox of redistribution. Beyond a certain point already reached in most modern democracies, raising the taxes on high incomes leads to more, not less, luxurious living by the rich, and to less, not more, support and opportunity for the poor. The failure to cure poverty is a worldview problem. When you embrace wrong assumptions about God, the world, and humanity, failure is not only likely, it's practically guaranteed. Section 3. Why counterfeit worldviews fail to cure poverty. Throughout understanding the culture, we've looked at how 6 different worldviews approach life's most complex problems based on what each holds to be true about God, the world, and our relationship to God and the world. Here's how each of these worldviews attempts to solve the poverty problem. Secularism. If the material world is all there really is no fundamental reason to fight poverty. Only the fittest survive. If people can't figure out how to survive on their own, too bad. In their desire to live long, healthy lives, though, secularists recognize that when some humans struggle to survive, it threatens the survival of us all. We're on a rock hurtling through space. We live and die together. Because secularists either don't believe in or don't care about the afterlife, their goal boils down to helping others live as long as possible. Feed them and give them medicine so they can live a greater number of disease-free days. There's another implication of the notion that the material world is all there is, the belief that economic resources are finite. We can't make more oil or minerals, for example, so if someone is hoarding, they should be punished because their greed harms the rest of us. If some people or groups have more, secularists reason, it can actually be an ethical good to take it from them. But who gets to decide what is fair to take and from whom? As the economist E. Calvin Beisner states, when people speak of the fair distribution of advantages, assets, and benefits among all members of a society, they tacitly assume that some identifiable person or persons other than God do the distributing, but no such moral actors exist with regard to the most important advantages, assets, and benefits. Typically, government is granted the power to do the taking because it can enforce its decisions through law. In essence, whoever decides to do the taking is claiming to know better than the rest what ought to be done. These individuals seek power not to set people free from the constraints that keep them from flourishing, but to gain the ability to enforce their decisions. For one group of secularists, those who embrace the teachings of Karl Marx, this is the whole point. Marxists believe this world's ills come from powerful people taking wealth away from others. The good life to the Marxist isn't one of creativity and hard work fostered by free enterprise, but of fomenting revolution to seize economic power by force. The end result of this process, the workers' paradise, is called communism. The path to communism is socialism, which Marx defined as the abolition of private property. By taking away private property, socialists aim to move power from the market to the government. Undoubtedly, many companies have abused their responsibilities in a craven drive for higher profits. Examples include pollution, unsafe work conditions, and price manipulation. Is turning power over to the government the best way to solve these problems, though? Critics of the Marxist approach point out that at least in a free market, people must serve in order to succeed. Natural resources or raw materials in and of themselves aren't productive. They require human thought, ingenuity, and energy to become useful. Land by itself produces only weeds. With people's hard work and creativity, land can produce enough fruits and vegetables to feed far more people than just the producer. Concentrating power in the government seems not to have this effect. Socialism requires a planned economy and state control of pricing, production, and distribution of goods and services. It relies on increased political power and a highly involved central government to achieve the goals of economic equality and a planned economy. Calvin Weisner says the only way to arrive at equal fruits is to equalize behavior, and that requires robbing men of liberty, making them slaves. The thousands of years of experiments with socialist economic systems mixed with Darwinian ideas of survival of the fittest made a toxic brew out of which some of the world's most infamous tyrants conjured up fascism, Nazism, and communism. And in a great historic irony, the response to the failures of government-sponsored socialism led not to a return to biblical ideas of stewardship, but to a cynical giving up of meaning altogether. It's called postmodernism. Like Marxism, the postmodern worldview says that the stories we accept about how the world works are cynical ploys designed to keep us in power by marginalizing others, the poor, the unemployed, migrants, and minorities. Unlike Marxism, postmodernism has no hope that revolution will solve the problem. Still, postmodernists think highly of socialism's promise to reverse the plight of the marginalized. As Stephen Hicks phrases it, postmodern thinkers inherit an intellectual tradition that has seen the defeat of all of its major hopes, but there was always socialism. As bad as the philosophical universe became in metaphysics, epistemology, and the study of human nature, there was still the vision of an ethical and political order that would transcend everything and create the beautiful collectivist society. Some postmodernists prefer to replace the term socialism with everyday economics. An older term is collectivism. Whatever name is used, there is a consistent denunciation of capitalism because it is said to prioritize profits over people, subject workers to grueling stress, and fleece consumers. Yet postmodernism solves little, seeming to content itself with critiquing modern systems. Critiquing modern ways of doing things, as we'll see, is also characteristic of the Islamic worldview. On the surface, Islam has much in common with Christianity's concern for the poor. In fact, the giving of alms, known as zakat, is one of the 5 clear requirements of being Muslim. Every Muslim is required to give 2.5%, 1/40th of his or her annual net income after expenses, taxes, and etc., to the poor, either directly or through charities. This enables the poor, widows, orphans, the sick, and the unfortunate to survive. In some Muslim countries, the zakat is enforced by law, while it remains voluntary and unaccounted for in others. Nevertheless, it's a duty Allah prescribes in the Quran, and Muslims believe that everyone will be held accountable in the final judgment. Below the surface, though, there are many differences between Islam and the Christian tradition. Whereas the Judeo-Christian ethic requires justice and charity to all, Muslims aren't mandated to help needy non-Muslims with their alms. Hamuda Abdulati listed 8 groups worthy of receiving help from the zakat: poor Muslims, needy Muslims, new Muslim converts, Muslim prisoners of war, Muslims in debt, Muslim employees whose wages are to be paid through the zakat, Muslims serving the cause of Allah, and Muslim wayfarers. Muslim scholars and apologists speak of the practice of zakat in grand terms. Abdulati said, "Zakat does not only purify the property of the contributor, but also purifies his heart from selfishness and greed for wealth. In return, it purifies the heart of the recipient from envy and jealousy, from hatred and uneasiness, and it fosters in his heart instead goodwill and warm wishes for the contributor. As a result, the society at large will purify and free itself from class warfare and suspicion, from ill feelings and distrust, from corruption and disintegration, and from all such evils." To this way of thinking, zakat is a form of worship, not a mere tax. That helping the poor is somehow a spiritual issue isn't just the view of Muslims. New spiritualists also frame economic issues in spiritual rather than material terms. New spirituality describes those in the Western world who draw on Eastern principles of tapping into a higher consciousness as the basis of the good life. By higher consciousness, New spiritualists mean a sort of force, like light and sound, that created the universe and may be tapped into to help us reach our dreams and make the world a better place. Sometimes higher consciousness is called God or Gaia, or simply consciousness. New spiritualists believe that as we evolve toward higher states of consciousness, we'll overcome our need for structures like capitalism and socialism. Marilyn Ferguson claimed, both capitalism and socialism, as we know them, pivot on material values. They are inadequate philosophies for a transformed society. Economic problems such as greed, theft, and covetousness are, according to actress and New Spiritualist advocate Shirley MacLaine, a manifestation of the need for human love. In one way, New Spiritualists agree with Christians that creativity, power, love, and joy are spiritual, not material values, and thus are not limited. Michael Bernard Beckwith says, the truth is that there's more than enough good to go around. There's more than enough creative ideas. There's more than enough power. There's more than enough love. There's more than enough joy. All of this begins to come through a mind that is aware of its own infinite nature. So how do we get abundance? By overcoming our false sense that we are deprived and starting to give generously. Eckhart Tolle put it this way, you don't have it, just act as if you had it and it will come. Then soon after you start giving, you will start receiving. You cannot receive what you don't give. Outflow determines inflow. This sounds like a biblical servanthood ethic, but the writings of most New Spiritualists show that it isn't as much a desire to see God glorified as it is to derive a personal sense of satisfaction in life. As Marianne Williamson says, our purpose on this earth is to be happy. It's about me. This is why personal prosperity, also known as universal enlightened production, is at the heart of New Spiritualist economics. Poverty comes from being unenlightened. When people achieve higher consciousness, they'll see their own true power and make economic choices that bring prosperity. Then poverty will disappear. Economic theorizing will be irrelevant. None of these views, secularism, Marxism, postmodernism, Islam, or New Spirituality, offers a vision of human flourishing in quite the same way Christianity does. Let's take a look at that next.